Hey listeners, this is the English adaptation of Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Para español, vuelva al feed y selecciona el título en español. Join the conversation on social media by tagging @ThisIsSonoro. The episode you're about to listen to contains descriptions of physical violence and stories of victims of disappearance. Listener discretion is advised. It's a quiet, lonely night. Down a dark alley at the edge of a canal, a yellow floodlight struggles to light the green facade of a small house. Suddenly, the door opens. A young, athletic, olive-skinned girl runs out. She's screaming for help. Behind her, a stout man appears. He's chasing her. Her screams fill the alley. Lights turn on as neighbors wake up to the sound. It's 11:01 p.m., and one of the neighbors calls 911.
Buenas noches, ¿cuál es su emergencia?
This is the actual audio from the call. Voices have been modified to preserve anonymity.
Acaba de disparar un disparo y ellos tienen miedo a llamar porque el vecino probablemente escuche.
The neighbor says he heard a shot next door. He's whispering because he is afraid that the shooter will hear him.
Escucharon un disparo de una persona a una mujer gritando.
We heard a shot and then a woman screaming, "Don't kill me," he says. But the 911 operator seems frustrated by the neighbor's whispers.
Regáleme bien la dirección. ¿Por qué necesito que me dé bien la ubicación?
Meanwhile, in the alley, the young woman keeps trying to escape. About 20 minutes later, the neighbor calls 911 again. Police officers have arrived in the area, but they are unable to find the girl or the assailant.
Al parecer el señor le pegó a una mujer con un tubo.
The neighbor reports that what he initially heard was not a gunshot. It was the sound of the man hitting the young woman with an iron pipe, he says. The woman falls to the ground.
Se revisa en la casa porque parece la arrastró hacia adentro.
Check inside the house. The man dragged her inside, and the policeman that came couldn't find them, he claims. 20 more minutes pass. It's 11:43 p.m., and another neighbor calls to report the scene.
Buenas noches, quería denunciar un posible caso de feminicidio.
¿Caso de?
She reports a possible femicide.
Cuando usted me dice feminicidio, ¿a qué se refiere usted?
Si ustedes me llegan a tiempo.
But the operator can't understand why she is using such a term. Femicide, he says? Yes, the caller responds. It's possible if you don't arrive on time. If you don't arrive on time. The neighbor knows well. Every minute that passes is a lost opportunity to save this young woman's life. But the emergency operators don't seem to understand the urgency.
Sí, porque ya más antes que usted ya habían reportado, ¿cómo se llama? Pero cuando usted me llamó como a las, quiero ver.
11:49.
The clock keeps ticking. It's been more than 58 minutes since the first neighbor called 911.
Y después de eso ya no se escuchó nada.
Everything goes quiet. Once again, silence reigns in Estevez Alley, Chalchuapa, El Salvador. But not for long. My name is Daniel Alvarenga. I'm a Salvadoran American journalist. Join me and hear how the discovery of a mass grave in El Salvador uncovered a crisis of violence and corruption, reaching up to the highest levels of government. It's a crisis that I followed from afar, but that ended up touching close to home. For Sonoro Media, in collaboration with Revista Factum, this is Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. Episode 1, The Grave. It's Friday, May 7th, 2021, in Chalchuapa, a rural town in the western part of El Salvador. Finally, An hour and a half after the young woman cried out, 2 police officers arrive. They begin to patrol the scene, walking up and down the alley, looking for the disturbance that prompted the frantic calls from neighbors.
La policía llega, empieza a patrullar, a observar el lugar, nadie da señales.
That's Mauricio Arriasachicas, head of the National Police Force. One of the officers spots a trail of blood leading up to the house. The front door is locked. The officers start trying to force open the door. It's made of a thick, heavy metal. Slowly, they begin to break down the door. Inside the house, the stout man knows he's trapped. The door begins to buckle. So he makes a decision. He slits his wrists. Blood begins to run down his arms and onto the floor, pooling at his feet. Finally, the police knock down the door. Inside, they find a terrible scene. The body of a stout man and 2 women, one younger, one older. The officers walk through the house. Arriasachicas, the head of police, describes the rest of the scene.
También la policía encuentra otros 2 cadáveres en una fosa a flor de tierra y se fija la escena y a ver qué es lo que ha pasado ahí.
Out back, the officers find 2 other bodies in a shallow grave. The bodies of men, the police chief says. When the officers approach the grave, there's a frightening smell emanating from it. One of the officers turns on his flashlight. Horrified, they discover it's full of what looks like severed human body parts. One of the officers returns to observe the other bodies. He notices that one of them is still breathing. The cops lift the stout man off the ground. He's still bleeding and still alive. He doesn't resist. He knows he's trapped. The man, the presumed murderer, is Hugo Ernesto Osorio Chavez, an ex-cop. The grave discovered at number 11 in Estevez Alley quickly became national news. I was following closely from Washington, D.C., where I live and work as a reporter. I looked on in horror as this sleepy town, known to many as a tourist destination, reckoned with this awful discovery. The horrific acts of Hugo Osorio, the alleged murderer, were so brutal even Israel Ticas, El Salvador's top criminologist, was shocked by what he found.
Yo tengo casi 33 años de ser forense y puedo decirle que nunca había visto una escena así.
In his 33 years investigating crime scenes, he'd never seen anything like this. Osorio, an ex-cop, had brought dozens of people, mostly women and girls, to his house. He dug a pit in his own backyard and buried their bodies, making them disappear into oblivion. Until now. According to the police logs we have access to for this podcast, on the same day of his arrest, Osorio confessed to having buried nearly 40 bodies of young women, adult men, and even that of a 2-year-old baby. The whole country was in shock. Everyone was talking about the case. It dominated the news.
Continúan los trabajos de excavación en el cementerio clandestino que el ex policía Hugo Osorio tenía en su vivienda.
Pasan los días y se suman más cadáveres encontrados por los investigadores. Hasta la fecha ya son 15 restos de personas ubicados.
Rumors swirled about the alleged killer, an ex-policeman, and his motives. An early estimate said 15 bodies had been found in the grave.
Gracias. Muy buenos días.
On May 9, 2 days after the discovery of the grave, Police Chief Arriasachicas joined Gustavo Villatoro, the Minister of Justice and Security, for a press conference, just a few feet away from the alleged murderer's house. The officials greeted the media.
Gracias a la oportuna intervención de nuestro equipo de emergencia, logramos la aprehensión en flagrancia de este psicópata.
And said that, thanks to the quick response from authorities, they were able to apprehend this man, who was In their words, a psychopath. After this conference, days passed with no new updates. The media still didn't know exactly what happened that fateful night in the alley. They also didn't know how many bodies were found in what might be the country's largest hidden grave. Behind the yellow caution tape, journalists continued to press the authorities for updates. They barely got any responses. Reporters on site only saw how, from time to time, a pickup truck would pull into the garage at the little greenhouse in Estevez Alley. A few hours later, the truck would drive off with white bags in the back. Authorities occasionally provided updates about the number of bodies they had found, but the numbers didn't add up.
Tenemos 6 cuerpos y tenemos 6 cráneos.
Aproximadamente unos 24 a 25 cuerpos.
Por eso es que sabemos que tenemos 8.
The lead criminologist on the case and a government official contradicted each other. 6 bodies to 24 or even 25. And Security Minister Gustavo Villatoro said they'd found 8 bodies. It didn't make sense. Amidst all the rumors and uncertainty, we still had yet to hear from one key voice, the country's most powerful official, President Nayib Bukele. 2 weeks after the discovery of the mass grave, he finally made a statement. On Twitter, President Nayib Bukele wrote that Hugo Ernesto Osorio, the confirmed killer in at least 15 murders, had been moved to a maximum security prison. And for his crimes, President Bukele expected him to remain in prison for more than a decade. After that tweet, official communication about the case stopped altogether. Neither the journalists covering the case nor the families of the victims received any new information. Something wasn't right. News from El Salvador rarely makes waves in the US. Even the discovery of this mass grave barely registered. I was getting most of my updates from Salvadoran outlets like Revista Factum and, of course, Twitter. This is part of why I'd gotten into journalism. In 2014, a so-called migrant crisis happened. Hundreds of people from El Salvador and other countries came to the US border seeking asylum. The media was flooded with horrific images. I wasn't surprised. El Salvador only registers during a crisis. One that directly impacts the US, like immigration, or captures the imagination of US audiences, like the endless, brutal accounts of gang violence. Still, I was frustrated. Many reporters couldn't even get the basics right. I saw more than a few outlets saying El Salvadoran. So I decided to do something about it. Being a journalist covering Salvadoran issues hasn't been easy. I'm often told there's no audience, but to me, it's essential, not just to correct the coverage and serve a sizable and engaged audience, but also because of my own history. My mom, like many others, fled the violence of El Salvador's civil war in the 1980s, sight set for California. She had a good job at the time. Born into a poor family, she started selling empanadas while going to school at night. Eventually, she got a job working payroll for the local government. When the Civil War started, she kept her head down. She just wanted to provide for her family. Then, one day, her brother Raul was killed. He was a medical student, a few years older. They were close. The circumstances of Raul's death were murky, and in the context of the war, it was dangerous to ask the kinds of questions she wanted to ask. As the war got worse, she worried for her children's safety. She decided to leave the country. So I was born in the US and had a happy childhood just outside of Los Angeles. I tell you this because Chalchuapa is familiar to me. I see other families dealing with the same uncertainty as my mother, wanting to ask questions, but grappling with the dangers that may bring, and with the government's silence. The discovery of this mass grave would also impact my own search for answers. To finally figure out what happened to my Raul, my uncle. For anyone like me, closely following the news of El Salvador, the name Bryan Avelar will be familiar. A reporter with Revista Factum, he also contributes regularly to the New York Times, Vice, The Guardian, and more. He's known for publishing hard-hitting investigations into gangs, government, corruption, and other sensitive, often dangerous topics. Bryan is the kind of reporter who's not afraid to call people out on Twitter, especially people in power. He knows his stuff, and he's not afraid to speak up about the truth. Bryan arrived at the gravesite in Chalchuapa to find dozens of mothers gathered. They'd come from across the country to this sleepy town in search of their missing loved ones. Bryan watched as they approached the yellow caution tape to ask authorities about their relatives.
No lo hacían enojados, tampoco tristes. Lo más duro fue escuchar en su voz la esperanza de que tal vez ahí encontrarían a su desaparecido. La escena parecía de una historia de ficción.
The mothers weren't angry or even sad. They were hopeful. Here, they might find their missing loved ones. The whole scene felt surreal. For 5 years, Bryan had been working as a reporter with Revista Factum. It's an online magazine specializing in long-form investigations. They're a small but dedicated team, often working on a shoestring budget. Factum's known for covering issues that other outlets, some of which are government-sponsored, can't or won't cover. Factum's reporters take on stories that put them in harm's way, giving people information they otherwise wouldn't get. A few years back, Bryan and the Factum team broke news about a corrupt national police unit acting as a de facto death squad. The investigation led to the firing of some of the accused policemen. It also put the Factum team in the government's crosshairs. When the Chalchuapa case came up, the Factum team was determined to find answers. Official sources remained silent. The only lead they had was the girl who'd screamed for her life in the alleyway that night. Luckily, her grandfather, Don Jose, was interviewed by the local news. He lamented his granddaughter's femicide.
Una esperanza para muchas familias, pues, ¿verdad? Porque digo yo que es una angustia.
Bryan traveled to Santana, a small city about 10 miles away from Chalchuapa, to meet with Don Jose.
Permiso, don José. Permiso.
Don Jose told Bryan that 26-year-old Jacqueline Lima was a hard worker. She worked at a well-known bakery and a local gas station. She also helped her mother run the small family grocery store. She was athletic, always on the move. Don Jose said that she could often be found running or riding her bike through the city's streets. Don Jose advised Bryan to visit Jacqueline's friends too.
Buenas tardes.
They lived just a few blocks away. Jacqueline's friends welcomed Bryan into the small house on the side of the road where they sell tortillas. It's a quiet, rural area outside of the city. Bryan sat and talked with them for a while.
Pero para ella siempre su hermano fue su hermano y que lo molestaran, ella siempre saltaba por el niño. Ella siempre cuidaba al hermano. Ella siempre anduvo detrás de Alexis. Ajá, cuidando los hermanos. Sí.
That's Iris, Jacqueline's childhood friend. Alexis, whom she's referencing, was Jacqueline's younger brother. She told Bryan that even though the two siblings fought, as many do, Jacqueline was always there for her brother. Bryan visited several times. He learned that Jacqueline lived with her mother, her brother Alexis, and her grandparents. He also learned more about Alexis. Alexis was 24 and studying medicine, thanks to the hard work of his mom, Mirna. She sent him to school with the money she earned from running her little grocery store. Like many young people in Latin America, Alexis was facing a difficult choice: stay and deal with the lack of job opportunities, or leave, go abroad, and hope to send money home. To better support his family, once he graduated, Alexis was hoping to go to the US. Mirna was working at the shop one day when a stout man came in. That was the first of many visits. The man kept coming back. Jacqueline's friends remember seeing him hanging around the shop. Eventually, he introduced himself. They got to chatting. Mirna shared that her son was thinking of leaving for the US. The stout man offered to help. He told Mirna that he had a brother who was working as a coyote. In exchange for $7,000, he could help Alexis cross the border. This was Alexis's opportunity, so he accepted. In the early hours of May 7th, he left his home for the US. In the afternoon, that same day, Mirna received a call. It was the stout man. He had bad news. Something had happened. Kidnappers had taken Alexis hostage. They were asking for money. He said Mirna had to come to his house, number 11 in Estevez Alley, to settle the matter. Mirna and Jacqueline jumped into action. Jacqueline, as she'd done all her life, didn't hesitate to show up for her brother. They closed the store early and set off for Chalchuapa. The trip took a while. It was more than 10 miles from their home, but Jacqueline and Mirna finally arrived at around 10 that night. When they entered the house, they found a horrible scene. Alexis hadn't been kidnapped. He was right there, dead, in the house. While Mirna stood, shocked, staring at the body of her son, the stout man grabbed a metal tube. He hit her in the head. Then he went for Jacqueline. She managed to escape. She set off running down the dark and lonely alley, crying for help. Her efforts were in vain. But still, her screams changed everything. Thanks to Jacqueline, the dark secrets hiding in number 11 Estevez Alley would finally come to light. While Bryan and the Factum team were investigating the Lima family's story, the authorities remained silent. The reporters continued looking into other leads without much success. Until one day, at the end of May 2021, one of their sources reached out. The source was offering to send a document that was important to the case. Bryan received the file. It was a confession from the ex-cop, the alleged killer. After weeks of silence, the document held many of the answers he and the public were looking for. Bryan began reading through the confession.
Esa noche encontré muchas respuestas en el documento. Lo que no sabía en ese entonces era que esa confesión desencadenaría una serie de reacciones del gobierno que jamás hubiera imaginado.
The document was revealing, and it confirmed a lot of what Bryan suspected. But Bryan never imagined what would come next, how the government would respond once they knew he had the confession. This document would set Bryan on a path to uncover a crisis in El Salvador, a crisis impacting the lives of hundreds of people, including mine, a crisis that the government was trying desperately to hide. Soon, Bryan would see just how far the government was willing to go to keep it hidden. And it would change his life.
Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador is a Sonoro original series, in collaboration with Revista Factum. This episode was produced by Fernanda Estrada and Hannah Bottom, with the help of Sara Mota. Written by Fernanda Estrada, Bryan Avelar, and Sara Mota. Adaptation by Hannah Bottom. Hosted by Daniel Alvarenga. Edited by Rodrigo Crespo and Nick Milanes. The managing editor was Rodrigo Crespo. Reporting by Bryan Avelar, Fernando Romero, and Gerson Nájera. Factum's team coordination and editorial consulting by Horus Villacorta. Fact-checking by Evelyn Uribe. Tape sync by Gerson Nájera and Marvin Siliesar. Mix and sound design by Fernando Galaviz. Original music by Laura Cruz and Héctor Fernández. Executive producers Jasmine Romero, Camila Victoriano, Jerónimo Ávila, and Joshua Weinstein. Thanks to Canal 12, Red Salvadoreña de Medios, and Noticias 4 Visión de TCS for archival tape.